Good evening and welcome back to the capitalist dystopia of Kuala Lumpur. Hope you're having an amazing day, because if you're having an amazing day, I'm having an amazing day. If I'm having an amazing day, you should be having an amazing day. And yes, I actually have a real job, but today I'd like to talk to you about the recent controversy that has gotten the entire nation's panties in a tizzy. So let's get into it. Don't you think capitalist architecture is just so fucking ugly? Yeah, it really is, you know. It feels like capitalism is like the purgatory stage before we get to the heaven on earth, or the Jannah on earth stage, known as socialism. We just have to endure this purgatory in-between stage before we get to the heaven on earth stage. But we will get there in time. But right now we have to endure the sordid necessity of capitalist architecture, which is quite an eyesore, really. Anyway, today I'd like to talk to you about the recent brouhaha that occurred as a result of the UiTM, or University Technology Mara, possibly admitting ethnic minority students. And as you know, some of the students at UiTM were not pleased. Okay, first of all, before we begin this video, I want to make it very clear that the point of this video is not to point fingers or condemn any racial group. So if you think this video is going to be bashing down on any particular racial group, please go to a different video. And if you have any prejudice against any racial group in this country, whether that be Malay people, or Chinese people, or Indian people, or Aboriginal people, or any other racial group in this country, please unsubscribe from my channel, because I do not want racists on my page. So, no matter whether you're Malay, or Chinese, or Indian, or any other race in this country, it is not my intention to condemn or slander you. Now, before we get into this video in depth, it's best for me to give you a brief overview on the races in Malaysia and the post-colonial situation that resulted in what we call bumiputra policies, or policies that benefit the Malays. Now, these policies, believe it or not, did not arise out of any particular malice towards the non-Malays. The reality was that in the post-colonial era of Malaysia, the Malays really were the poorest group in the country. And the poorest Malay lived worse than the poorest Chinese at the time. Now, what happened was then the result of socio-economic factors. I know that social Darwinists like Lee Kuan Yew will say, oh no, it's because of genetics, that the Chinese and Indians apparently are simply of a higher genetic stock. That's according to Lee Kuan Yew. But I don't quite agree with that analysis, because the three races of Malaysia, the Malays, the Chinese, and Indians, have undergone very, very different sets of historical trajectories. The Indians, for the most part, were in the rubber plantations. For the most part, the Chinese were in the tin mines, and the Peranakan, well, he was basically the middleman minority. Not too Malay or too Chinese to, just considered malleable enough for the British. But the Malays, on the other hand, underwent a slightly different trajectory from the Chinese and the Indians, because the Malays were by and large kept in the rural areas and barred from commerce and industry. So if a Chinese tin miner, for example, had become wealthy enough as a result of working for a capitalist for a couple of years mining tin, he might experience some upward mobility by becoming a tauke, which is basically a merchant. But not exactly a capitalist, because the merchant doesn't really engage in the mode of production that you would describe as the capitalist mode of production, because the merchant basically follows the CMC circuit, commodity, money, commodity circuit. So the merchant doesn't actually produce any surplus value. But the Chinese found that they could gain upward mobility basically by becoming merchants after working and being exploited by capitalists for a couple of years. While on the other hand, the Malay peasant during colonial times did not have that option, because the Malay peasant was basically kept in the rural areas and basically barred from commerce and industry. And if a peasant accumulated too much wealth, that wealth would simply be taken away by the Sultan. So basically the Tauke, the Chinese Tauke as a result, got his commodities from the peasant. So he would buy the commodities from the peasant at a cheap price and sell them slightly dearly to make a profit, of course. But this is not the profit of surplus value, but rather the profit of circulating commodities, basically. Anyway, because the Chinese and the Malays had such different trajectories, the Chinese were not under the feudal system. They were allowed to participate in trade and basically experience some degree of upward mobility. And also because the Chinese and the Indians, as a result of working for the British capitalists in the tin mines or the rubber plantations, or if we're talking about the Peranakans as the middlemen, they had far more experience with capitalism than the Malays, who were kept in feudal bondage as literal slaves of the sultans and then thrust cruelly from feudalism to capitalism in 1957. So the post-colonial leadership of Malaysia, people like Tunku Abdul Rahman, for example, the first Prime Minister of Malaysia, were worried that if the Malays did not have a tongkat or a crutch or some policies that would protect them, affirmative action policies, if you will, they might drown. They might be crushed by the Chinese and the Indians, who had had half a century of a head start with capitalism compared to the average Malay who was just getting used to this strange new world. And so you have policies known as bumiputra policies, or policies which are meant to safeguard the special position of the Malays. That's according to the constitution. And while it's very, very popular, especially among liberals, to argue that these are inherently racist policies designed to hold the Chinese or the Indians back, the original intention of these policies was really quite benign. The intention was basically to level out the playing field between the Malays and the Chinese and the Indians. But what it did was it created a strata of elite bourgeois Malays that end up reproducing their class privileges through these policies, even if their children don't need, for example, to take advantage of affirmative action, even if affirmative action could better be used to serve a poor Malay from a rural village. Well, you still see the elite bourgeois members of the Malay capitalists taking advantage of these policies to reproduce their class privileges. So fundamentally, these policies started out benign, but at the end of the day, they are being used as tools by the elite reactionary members of the Malay bourgeoisie in order to reproduce their class privileges. And, well, by taking the places of that should be going to poor members of the non-Malay communities in public universities, for example, what is happening is that now there is a wealth gap, or I should say a wealth gap is being created and being exacerbated, in fact, the wealth gap between the rich Malays and the poor Malays is being exacerbated, but the wealth gap between the rich and poor in this country is generally being exacerbated, because at this moment, not only are wealthy bourgeois Malays taking advantage of affirmative action policies that were meant to uplift poor members of the Malay community, poor Chinese and Indian Malaysians who are not protected by capital are being barred from scholarships and barred from university because of their race, and thus falling into even deeper poverty, making upward mobility even harder for the poorest members of the Chinese and Indian communities. So while the poor or average Malays are sort of stagnating because the biggest goodies are being seized by the elite bourgeois reactionary members of the bumiputra community, what has happened now is that not only have bumiputra policies basically sort of, caused certain people, certain blood-sucking parasites to take advantage of these policies when they don't even need to. Now, they are basically causing poor Chinese and Indians to fall far behind, being barred from the only places that they can afford, public universities, and being barred from receiving scholarships, even though they may need a scholarship more than a wealthy Malay who gets the scholarship by virtue of his race. But I have to add a caveat in this video that it is not my intention to finger point at the whole Malay community, because many people, because they're so angry at these unjust policies, they're so angry at these policies that really hurt the poorest and most marginalized members of the Indian and Chinese community, they end up pointing fingers at the entire Malay group, which is itself a mistake. Because fundamentally, the problem that I see is not the average working class Malay person. He or she is not a problem. He or she actually needs to go to public university. The average Malay working class person is also trying to survive in this capitalist hellscape. The average Malay working class person is not the cause of minorities' problems. I just have to say this very, very loudly and clearly. The average Malay working class person, in fact, is not the one who wants to reproduce bumiputra policies. The average Malay working class person does not think of reproducing class privileges he or she does not even have. So I don't want you to point at students from UiTM and all think, oh, if you're a Malay student in UiTM, you must be some lazy, useless degenerate. I don't want you to think that, and if you say anything like that on my channel, I will tell you to leave, okay? Because the biggest reactionaries, let me tell you, come from the elite bourgeois class, who in colonial times would have been happy compradors and are now trying to reap the benefits or reap the advantages of affirmative action when they themselves were the class that bullied the poorest and most downtrodden Malay peasants. Yes, the elites of society are to blame, not the average working class person who just wants to make a living and educate their children. So the fact of the matter is that there was a brouhaha in UiTM, and many and quite a few students made an official statement asking for UiTM students to dress in black in order to show their displeasure at the admission of non-Malay students. And I think it's a mistake that some people make to get this knee-jerk reaction and think that, oh, Malays are racist. That's the knee-jerk reaction many of you get. Malaysia is a racist country. But you will find the vast majority of these people protesting and expressing extremely indignant attitudes towards non-Malays entering come from the elite bourgeois class of T20s that don't even need to be in UiTM in the first place. Poor or working class people generally do not care who their classmates are. They are not the problem. They just want to get an education and uplift their social. They just want to get an education and basically improve their lot in life, attain some social mobility, if you will. But they're not thinking about defending class privileges. But in this case, as some would say, race is a proxy for class. Because in this case, who stands to benefit more from affirmative action and bumiputra politics? The poor Malay in the village who can hardly even, think about studying when he has to help his mother, run her business because there are several siblings to worry about, that she has to worry about, or the rich, pampered bourgeois Malay who doesn't even need the affirmative action but takes advantage of it anyway. I'll tell you, the poor or working class Malay is not to be blamed. So while I can agree that, affirmative action has run its course, and this is basically an outmoded policy that doesn't need to be in place anymore, because quite palpably there are many, many poor minority students who cannot afford an education, who also need help. You have to understand that the intention of this policy, yes, you can say the road to hell was paved with good intentions, but the intention of this policy was basically to protect the Malays at a time when they weren't even sure that the Chinese or Indians would be loyal citizens to Malaysia, because the Chinese or Indians hadn't even become citizens, right? So at the time we were still, living in sort of like a limbo stage, if you will. But the point is, you can't deny that it started out with benign objectives. I think that any honest historian who makes an honest analysis of bumiputra politics will at least admit that they started out with benign objectives, but over time started getting abused by people who did not have any need for them in the first place. It's kind of like a rich man taking advantage of a public hospital that was meant for a poor person. But since everybody is a citizen of Malaysia at this point, there's no need for these policies that only admit one race or severely limit other races from entering an educational institution, because everyone pays taxes. Poor minority children's parents also pay taxes. So I don't see why their children ought to be barred from a place of learning. Of course, race-based politics, as I've mentioned time and again, are meant to divide the masses. And basically, these politics are kept on life support in order to breed resentment among the masses. But the reality is that the biggest barrier towards ending race-based politics is not the average working class person in this country of any race. The biggest barrier is the group that stands to gain the most out of these politics. And who has the most to gain and the most to lose as a result of these politics getting scrapped? Yes, the capitalist class, the bumiputra capitalist class, not the working class. Because the capitalist class knows how to game the system, and they know how to take advantage of cables, and they basically have, the best connections. So while the poor working class Malays get anchovies, the children of the elite bourgeois class get salmons and tunas. That's basically it. But then other people end up falling into this kind of false consciousness and thinking that Malays are all equally privileged and they've all had easy lives, basically, even though there are Malays who work very, very hard. And it's a very unfair generalization, but that's the generalization that the capitalist parasites have basically led people to believing. It's an unfair generalization, no doubt, but it's a generalization that was started by the capitalist class, the children of the capitalist class, who take advantage of policies, of affirmative action policies that they don't actually need to take advantage of. I can tell you that most Malay students who go to UiTM from poor or working class backgrounds do not think like, oh, those damn Chinese or Indians are going to take my privileges away. Most of them are just trying to basically get their degree and enter the workforce and try to be a decent contributing citizen. And those people who started the Blackshirt campaign, very aptly named by the way, since Mussolini himself had a Blackshirt campaign of his own, I can tell you, come from the privileged, elite, and moneyed class. They do not come from the working class, okay? They come from the privileged, elite, and moneyed class that are afraid of losing their privileges and will fight tooth and nail to defend them. It is a characteristic of the entitled and privileged strata of the capitalist class. And, the bourgeoisie are in general entitled and privileged, aren't they? So do not think of it as a characteristic of the Malay community, and do not stereotype or pigeonhole all Malay people under the same brush, okay? It's a characteristic of the moneyed, entitled bourgeois class, the class that we socialists are opposed to, the bourgeoisie. And do not fall into the trap in believing that everyone has the same mentality as these black shirts. They do not. So what can I say about those racist clowns who donned black shirts in order to protest against the intake of ethnic minority students? Well, I can say that they should be treated with the same kind of opprobrium as any Zionist or any black shirt, any one of Mussolini's henchmen, because that's what they are. They're basically the Malaysian version of the National Socialists. Basically, they should not be given any face. They should be treated like the racists they are. They should be so ashamed of themselves that while students in America are protesting against a brutal authoritarian regime, the brutal authoritarian regime of Israel, we have our very own local Zionists who are trying to bar fellow Malaysians from getting an education because they're too afraid of losing their class privileges. I think that we should criticize them without mercy. We should criticize the bourgeoisie without mercy. And the bourgeoisie basically, have reached the point when they think they're beyond criticism. No. I say that those students who organized that movement should be dealt with severely. They should face severe disciplinary action, if not by the university, by future employers. They should be blacklisted because they have been shown that they do not speak up for the best interests of Malaysians. Because if you don't speak up for the best interests of all Malaysians, you don't speak up for the best interests of Malaysia. You are not a socialist if you only believe in socialism for one race and one strata of that race. You are a national socialist. So yeah, I like to end this video by saying National Socialism is not part of our culture, and let's take back our beautiful country from these people. Bye-bye.